Sarah Martinez stood in her kitchen at 6:15 a.m. on March 13, 2019, waiting for her coffee to brew. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains she'd hung in this kitchen 7 years ago, when she and her husband Tom had first bought the house in the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon. It was a beautiful home, a craftsman-style bungalow with a wraparound porch, a garden that she'd meticulously landscaped, and a neighborhood where children played safely on tree-lined streets. She pressed her fingertips against the warm ceramic of her coffee mug and smiled to herself, thinking about the day ahead. Today was important at middle school. She was presenting her students with a special assignment, a project she designed over the past month titled Ordinary Americans Who Changed History. Sarah loved these moments, when she could see her students' eyes light up as they discovered that history wasn't just dates and dead people in textbooks. It was alive in the choices everyday people made, in the courage it took to stand up for what was right, and in the power of individual voices to reshape the world. At 38 years old, Sarah felt she'd found her purpose in inspiring these young minds, helping them understand that they too could matter, could make a difference. The morning routine at the Martinez household was a symphony she'd perfected over 13 years of motherhood. Sarah moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing lunch boxes for Emma, her 12-year-old daughter, and her 9-year-old son. Emma wanted a turkey and Swiss sandwich with extra mustard, apple slices, and chocolate chip cookies, the same lunch she'd requested every day for the past 2 weeks. More adventurous and temperamental, changed his mind daily, so Sarah always made something flexible. Today it was a PB&J, which he'd probably complain about tomorrow but would eat gratefully today. Her husband Tom emerged from the bedroom, already dressed in his business casual attire. He worked as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, a job that paid well and left him reasonably satisfied with life. They'd met in college, a blind date arranged by mutual friends, and had somehow managed to build something real together. Not a passionate, sweeping romance like in the movies, but something more enduring, a partnership built on respect, shared values, and genuine care. They'd weathered the usual storms of marriage, financial stress during the recession, the exhaustion of early parenting, the slow cooling of physical passion that comes with age and routine. But they'd come through it stronger, or at least intact. "Morning," Tom mumbled, kissing her cheek as he passed. He poured his own coffee and checked his phone for emails, a habit she'd gently complained about for years but had given up trying to change. "Don't forget you have to pick up from soccer practice today," Sarah reminded him, though she knew she'd probably have to remind him again via text message around 4 p.m. "I got it," he said, but his eyes were already on his phone. Sarah didn't mind. This was their rhythm, their normal, their beautiful, ordinary life. At middle school, Sarah's classroom was her sanctuary. The walls were covered with posters of historical figures and inspiring quotes. Students' essays and projects hung from colorful string in the corners. She kept a jar of candy on her desk, a reward system that probably violated modern pedagogical guidelines, but that her students loved. By third period, when her homeroom class arrived for their history lesson, Sarah had already reviewed her lesson plan 3 times and was genuinely excited to begin. Her students loved her. She could see it in the way they greeted her, the way they stayed after class to ask follow-up questions, the way they didn't groan when she announced a pop quiz. Teaching was the one area of her life where Sarah felt completely confident in her abilities. She understood adolescents, their insecurities, their hunger for meaning, their desperate need to feel seen and valued. She treated them with respect while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She challenged them without crushing them. She was, by any measure, an exceptional teacher. That evening, Sarah prepared Tom's favorite dinner, lasagna with a salad and garlic bread. The family ate together at their dining room table, a practice she insisted upon despite the kids' preference for eating in front of screens. Emma talked about her math test, described in elaborate detail a playground conflict that had since been resolved. Tom contributed updates from work. Sarah listened, asked follow-up questions, and felt that deep sense of contentment that comes from knowing your people are safe, healthy, and happy. After dinner, she helped with homework, supervised screen time, and tucked both children into bed with hugs and kisses. At 9:30 p.m., Sarah was reading in bed when her phone buzzed. It was a text from her brother David, a message she almost didn't see before sleep took her. Need to talk. Important. Sarah and David had a complicated relationship. He was 5 years younger, and their childhood had been marked by their father's alcoholism and their mother's exhaustion. While Sarah had channeled her pain into achievement, good grades, scholarships, careful life planning, David had struggled. He dropped out of community college, cycled through jobs, struggled with various addictions, and had spent time in rehabilitation programs. Sarah loved him, but she'd learned the hard way that trying to rescue him only enabled his destructive patterns. She'd set boundaries with him years ago, and while it pained her, it had been necessary for her own families. She texted back, "Call me tomorrow morning." But David didn't call the next morning. Instead, he showed up in person on Saturday afternoon at Sarah's door, looking thin and desperate. She almost didn't let him in. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. But when she looked into his eyes and saw the desperation there, she couldn't turn away. This was her little brother, the boy she'd helped raise when their mother was working 2 jobs, the person she loved despite everything. "I need a place to stay," David said without preamble. "Just for a few weeks. I promise it's temporary. I got myself into some trouble, but I'm working through it. I found a program and I'm getting clean, but I need somewhere stable while I do it. I can't stay with my friends anymore. They're not good for me. I need family." Sarah's heart broke for him. She knew she should say no. She knew that enabling him was wrong. But she also knew that sometimes faith in another person's ability to change was the only thing that mattered. "Okay," she heard herself say. 2 weeks. Then you need to find another arrangement. And David, I mean it, you need to really commit to getting better this time." He hugged her with tears in his eyes, and she believed him. She wanted to believe him. She let him use the guest bedroom downstairs, made him comfortable, and went about her life thinking she'd done the right thing. She had no idea that this single act of family compassion would unravel everything. The morning of March 14th, 2019 began like any other Thursday morning in the Martinez household. Sarah woke at 5:45 a.m. to the sound of her alarm, that gentle electronic chime she'd set specifically to avoid startling Tom awake. She had a ritual, 20 minutes of quiet time before the household stirred. She'd make coffee, sit on the porch regardless of weather, and mentally prepare for the day ahead. It was her anchor, the one thing she did for herself in a life largely devoted to others. Sarah padded downstairs in her slippers, her worn Columbia University hoodie draped over her shoulders, a relic from her college days that she refused to discard despite Tom's gentle suggestions that it was looking shabby. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick-tick-tick of the kitchen clock. She loved this quiet time, this pocket of peace before the noise and demands of the day consumed her. She started the coffee maker and moved through the quiet kitchen, already thinking about her lesson plan. She was teaching about civil disobedience today, Parks, Martin King, the sit-ins and marches of the civil rights movement. She wanted her students to understand that ordinary people, people who were scared and tired and uncertain, had found the courage to challenge an unjust system. The irony of this would later haunt her. At 6:15 a.m., Sarah poured her first cup of coffee into her favorite mug, a ceramic one Emma had made in art class years ago, painted with childish but earnest effort, and stepped onto the porch. The March air was cool and slightly damp. Portland's clouds hung low over the neighborhood, that soft gray that felt both depressing and comforting. She sipped her coffee and watched the neighborhood wake. A jogger passed by. A neighbor left for an early shift at a hospital downtown. The world felt normal, safe, predictable. At 6:47 a.m., everything changed. Sarah heard it first, a sound like thunder but not weather, the crack of her front door being breached, the distinctive sound of the frame splintering. For a moment her mind couldn't process what was happening. Then came the shouting, voices yelling commands, and her door flying open. Federal agents in tactical gear poured into her home like a dark tide, weapons drawn, faces obscured behind helmets and intimidation. "Down, get down on the ground," a voice screamed. Sarah's coffee mug slipped from her hands. It fell to the hardwood floor and shattered, ceramic shards scattering across the porch and into the house. The coffee pooled like blood. "Please, what is this?" Sarah stammered, her body moving toward the ground by instinct rather than understanding. An agent grabbed her arm roughly and slammed her against the wall of her own home, her face pressed hard against the drywall. She could taste drywall dust in her mouth, feel the pressure of a gun against her back. "Sarah Martinez," a voice demanded. Yes, I'm Sarah Martinez. What's happening? Why?" "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words of the Miranda rights washed over her like cold water, surreal and incomprehensible. This was something that happened on television, not in her life, not in her home. Upstairs, her children heard the commotion. Emma, always the early riser, was already half awake when the raid began. She heard the voices, the commands, and the pure animal fear in her mother's cry of confusion. She shook awake, and within seconds, both children appeared at the top of the stairs in their pajamas. "Mommy," screamed, his 9-year-old voice cracking with terror. "Mommy, what's happening?" Sarah's heart shattered in a way that the coffee mug never could. She was on her knees now, being zip-tied, and she could see her children at the top of the stairs, face red and streaked with tears, Emma's expression frozen in shock and disbelief. "Mom," Emma shouted, "what did you do?" "I didn't do anything, baby. I don't understand. Mommy doesn't understand." An agent moved toward the stairs to prevent the children from coming down. A female officer, one of the few who didn't look like she wanted to hurt someone, approached Emma and with slightly softer body language. "Kids, you need to go back to your room. Is there an adult nearby, a neighbor or family member?" Emma's voice shook as she called out the name of their neighbor, Mrs., who lived 3 houses down and had watched them before. Within minutes, the children were in Mrs.'s arms, their small bodies rigid with shock and confusion, their eyes fixed on their mother being led away in handcuffs. Tom emerged from the bedroom, confused and terrified, just as Sarah was being moved toward the door. His eyes went wide with incomprehension. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" "I don't know," she cried, looking back at him at her home, at the wreckage of her normal life. "Tom, I don't know. Call a lawyer. Please call a lawyer." The federal agents didn't answer his questions either. They simply led Sarah out of her home, down the front steps, and into the waiting black SUV. It was at this moment that she noticed the news vans beginning to appear on the street, cameras being set up, reporters holding microphones and looking hungry. Somehow, the media already knew. The ride to the federal building downtown felt like a hallucination. Sarah sat in the back of the vehicle, zip-tied, her hands already numb. The agent driving didn't speak. She tried to think, tried to make sense of what was happening, but her brain seemed to have stopped functioning in any meaningful way. At the federal building, she was led through corridors, her confusion and desperation growing with each step. In the interrogation room, 2 agents sat across from her at a metal table. "Do you know why you're here?" one asked, a man with cold eyes and a wedding ring he twisted unconsciously. "I have no idea. There's been a mistake. I teach middle school. I haven't done anything." "Your brother, David Martinez, is already cooperating with us. He's told us everything about your involvement in the trafficking operation." Sarah's blood went cold. "Trafficking? I don't know anything about trafficking. David's my brother. He stayed with me for a few weeks, but he wouldn't. Your name is on property deeds. Your name is on financial documents. Your name connects you directly to a house that was used to hold trafficking victims. Your brother says you knew all about it." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She kept saying she didn't understand, that there was a mistake, that her brother must have used her name without permission. The agent seemed almost amused by her denials. "Here's what we know," the cold-eyed agent said, sliding photographs across the table. "This is a property. Your name is on the deed. This property was used to house at least 4 trafficking victims over a 6-month period. We have testimonies. We have financial records. What we want to know is who else was involved and what your exact role was in all of this." Sarah looked at the photographs, a rundown house she'd never seen before in her life. She thought of David, of his desperation, of the way he'd shown up at her door. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what must have happened. Had he used her identity? Had he forged her name? "I want to talk to a lawyer," she whispered. "That's your right," the agent said, standing up. "But understand, every minute you don't cooperate makes you look more guilty. Your brother's going to testify against you. Your name's all over the evidence. The only people who are getting deals are the ones who flip." As they led her away, Sarah heard one agent say to another, "Teacher involved in human trafficking ring. Media's going to eat this up." That's when she understood the true magnitude of what was happening. It wasn't just the charges. It was the narrative. It was the story the world would tell about her before she even had a chance to defend herself. The holding cell at the Federal Detention Center was 8 feet by 10 feet. Gray concrete walls. A metal toilet bolted to the floor with no seat. A thin plastic mattress on a metal shelf that served as a bed. A single fluorescent light that never turned off, casting everything in a harsh, sickly white glow. Sarah had been in this cell for 37 hours, though time had become an abstract concept. She'd stopped trying to keep track after the first day. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her children's faces at the top of the stairs. She heard screaming, "Mommy." She saw Emma's expression shift from confusion to something darker, a dawning realization that her mother, the person she trusted most in the world, might not be who she thought she was. A guard brought her a tray of food, something that might have been a sandwich, a cup of lukewarm water, an apple. Sarah couldn't eat. Her stomach was in knots, her throat too tight to swallow. She'd vomited twice already, nothing but bile. On the morning of the 3rd day, a woman appeared at her cell. She was tall, in her 50s, with sharp gray eyes and a gray blazer that matched her steely demeanor. Her name was, and she was the public defender assigned to Sarah's case. "We need to talk about your situation," said, sitting on the metal bench across from Sarah. She didn't try to sugarcoat anything. "I've reviewed the initial evidence, and I'm not going to lie to you, it's damaging." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. "What do you mean? There's been a mistake. I didn't do anything. I don't know anything about trafficking. My brother." "Your brother," interrupted, "has already entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal government. He's agreed to testify against you in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's claiming that you knew about the property being used as a safe house for trafficking victims. He's claiming you helped manage financial transactions related to the operation." The room tilted. Sarah gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. "That's a lie. He's lying. David wouldn't. He's my brother. Why would he lie?" His expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of compassion buried beneath her professional demeanor. "Because his cooperation saves him 15 to 20 years in prison. Because he's scared. Because people facing the consequences of their own actions often make choices that hurt others. I've seen it 100 times." "So what happens now?" Sarah whispered. "The prosecution is offering you a deal. You cooperate with them against your brother and whoever else was involved in the trafficking ring. You testify. You help them build their case. In exchange, they'll recommend leniency at sentencing." Sarah's head was spinning. "But I don't know anything. I can't testify about something I wasn't part of." "Then," said quietly, "you're looking at 20 to 25 years in federal prison. The charges are serious: conspiracy, money laundering, potential RICO violations. They have your name on documents. They have your brother's testimony. They have financial records with your signature. Without cooperation, a jury is going to look at that evidence and convict you. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she hadn't consciously started crying. I didn't do this. I'm a teacher. I teach history. I teach children about justice and integrity. I didn't do this. I believe you, said, and Sarah thought she meant it. But belief isn't evidence. We need to figure out how your name got on those documents, and we need to prove that you had no knowledge of or involvement in the trafficking operation. That's our defense. My brother must have forged my name. He must have. Proving forgery is difficult. And right now, the government's narrative is stronger than ours. They have momentum, they have your brother's cooperation, and they have media pressure. The story has legs: beloved teacher involved in human trafficking ring. It's the kind of narrative that makes prosecutors' careers. Explain the process: preliminary hearing, grand jury, potential trial. She used words like discovery and motions and plea negotiations. Sarah's head ached trying to absorb information while her entire world was collapsing. I'm going to request bail, said, but given the severity of the charges, I'm not optimistic. They'll argue you're a flight risk. They'll argue the charges are serious. They might grant bail with restrictive conditions. She was wrong. 2 days later, at Sarah's preliminary hearing, bail was. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to the prosecution's arguments and pleas, then announced that Sarah would remain in federal custody pending trial. No, Sarah breathed, not believing what she was hearing. Please, I have children. I need to be home with my children. The judge didn't acknowledge her. The gavel came down. Sarah was led away. That night, Tom visited her for the first time since her arrest. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 4 days. His face was drawn, his eyes red. He sat across from her in the visitation area, separated by thick, speaking through a prison phone. The school suspended you, he said without preamble. Full suspension with pay pending investigation, but everyone knows what that means. I know, Sarah whispered. The media is outside the house. Every morning, news vans, our neighbors have been distant. Some of them won't even make eye contact. Sarah wanted to tell him that she was innocent, that this was all a horrible mistake, but the words felt hollow even in her own mind. The documents with her name, the property deed, her brother's cooperation, it all sounded so damning. Emma asked me if you were a bad person, Tom said, his voice cracking. Our 12-year-old daughter asked me if her mother was a bad person. What was I supposed to tell her? Tom, I don't understand how this happened, how we got here. A month ago, everything was normal, everything was fine, and now. I didn't do this, Sarah said, but it sounded like a plea, not a statement of fact. Tom's face hardened. I'm going to support the kids. I'm going to be there for them. But I need you to understand that I'm struggling to reconcile the woman I married with what the news is saying about you. I'm trying to believe you, but I'm also looking at the evidence and I don't know what to believe anymore. After he left, Sarah returned to her cell and lay on the plastic mattress under the fluorescent light that never turned off. She stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how her life had become this. A week ago, she'd been preparing lesson plans. She'd been making her daughter's favorite lasagna. She'd been reading novels before bed. She'd been happy. Now she was in federal custody, accused of crimes she didn't commit, abandoned by the world, with her children growing up in a home fractured by her absence. Her brother had betrayed her. The legal system was designed to crush her. The media had already declared her guilty. In that moment, lying in the darkness, which didn't actually exist because the light never turned off, Sarah understood the true nature of injustice. It wasn't just about being accused of something you didn't do. It was about how quickly, how completely, the system could dismantle your life. How easily the narrative could be written against you. how the machinery of the law could grind you into dust regardless of your innocence. She wondered if anyone would ever believe her again. She wondered if she would ever get out. And she wondered if her children would remember her as their mother or as the woman whose picture appeared on the news labeled as a criminal. Sarah had been in federal custody for 11 days when she was transported to the courthouse for her preliminary hearing. She'd been allowed to shower for the first time in a week and had provided her with a gray pantsuit that didn't fit quite right. It hung loose on her frame because she'd lost weight rapidly, her anxiety and the prison food combining to create an almost involuntary diet. She looked in the mirror of the holding cell and barely recognized herself. Dark circles hung under her eyes like bruises. Her skin was pale from days under fluorescent lights. Her hair, which she'd always kept carefully styled, hung limp around her face. "You need to look sympathetic," had advised that morning. "The judge needs to see you as a person, not a criminal. Sit up straight, make eye contact, don't show anger, show confusion and hurt." Sarah nodded numbly. She felt all of those things, confusion and hurt especially. The anger was there too, simmering beneath the surface, but she'd learned to suppress it. Anger made her look guilty. The courtroom was larger than she expected, with ornate woodwork and the seal of the federal government emblazoned on the wall behind the judge's bench. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that seemed to float like tiny ghosts. The prosecution team sat at a table to the right, 3 attorneys, including the cold-eyed man who'd interrogated her, along with several administrative staff and evidence boxes. They looked organized, confident, prepared. They looked like they were certain of her guilt. Sat beside Sarah at the defense table, papers arranged in front of her, a legal pad with notes scribbled in her own shorthand. To Sarah's left, federal marshals sat with the calm detachment of people who'd seen this play out 1,000 times before. Judge entered and everyone stood. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She settled into her chair and opened her file. "This is the preliminary hearing for Sarah Martinez on charges of conspiracy in human trafficking, money laundering, and RICO violations," the judge announced. "The prosecution may proceed." The lead prosecutor, a man named Richard, stood and delivered his opening statement with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He spoke about the trafficking operation, about victims who'd been held in a property Sarah's name appeared on, about financial transactions that moved money through accounts linked to her. He spoke about David Martinez's cooperation and his willingness to testify about his sister's involvement. He painted a picture of Sarah as a cold, calculating accomplice to a serious federal crime. It was a narrative designed to destroy her, and Sarah could see it working. The judge's expression remained neutral, but her eyes tracked the prosecutor's words carefully. When finished, stood and attempted to counter, but she was fighting a battle where the other side had all the heavy weapons. "Your Honor, the evidence the prosecution is presenting is circumstantial at best. My client's name appearing on documents does not prove knowledge or participation. There's no direct evidence linking Ms. Martinez to the trafficking operation, no testimony from victims placing her at the location, no financial records showing her personally profiting from any transactions. But there are records showing her involvement with the property," the judge observed. "There are records showing her name, Your Honor. That's different from proving her involvement." It was a valiant effort, but Sarah could see the judge wasn't convinced. Then the prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor, the government would like to present a visual demonstration of the forensic capabilities used in this investigation. We believe it will help establish the thoroughness of our investigation and the reliability of the evidence we've collected." Sarah heard shift beside her, felt a question forming, but before her attorney could object, 2 federal agents entered the courtroom. Between them was Duke. The German Shepherd was massive, muscular and beautiful, his tan and black coat gleaming under the courtroom lights. He moved with the confident gait of an animal who'd been trained extensively and praised for his work. His handler, Officer James, was a man in his early 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his career in law enforcement. He held Duke's leash with the casual confidence of someone utterly certain of his control over the animal. Duke is a certified K-9 officer with 18 years of service, the prosecutor explained. He's been trained in narcotics detection, explosives detection, and forensic evidence location. His record is impeccable, hundreds of successful detections, 0 false positives. Officer is Duke's primary handler and has worked with him for 12 years. Sarah found herself leaning forward despite her intentions to remain neutral. The dog was remarkable. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a presence that seemed to fill the courtroom. She'd always liked dogs, though she and Tom had never gotten one because of her teaching schedule and the kids' allergies. Looking at Duke, she felt a strange connection, as if this animal might be the one truly innocent being in this room. Officer led Duke to a position near the prosecution's evidence table, and the prosecutor began explaining the dog's capabilities. Duke will be positioned here to demonstrate the reliability of our investigation methodology. And that's when something shifted. Duke's ears flattened against his head. The dog began pulling against his leash, not aggressively but with clear agitation. His mouth opened, and a low whine emerged from deep in his chest. Officer immediately tried to correct the behavior, jerking the leash, issuing commands, but Duke continued to pull, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for escape. "Sorry, Your Honor," Officer said, his face flushing. "Duke seems a bit stressed by the courtroom environment. Let me." But Duke's distress was growing, not diminishing. He began packing, his movements erratic, his whining becoming more pronounced. His tail, which should have been alert and high, was tucked partially between his legs. It was the behavior of a dog under extreme stress, not a confident, trained officer. The judge frowned. "Officer, can you control your dog?" "Yes, Your Honor, he's usually very calm. I'm not sure what's." Officer applied more pressure to the leash, but it only made Duke more agitated. The dog lunged toward the evidence table, then away from it, his behavior increasingly erratic. Sarah watched, fascinated despite her fear. Something about the dog's distress felt significant, though she couldn't articulate why. "Perhaps we should remove the dog from the courtroom," suggested to the judge. "I agree," Judge said tersely. "Officer, take your dog outside until it's settled." But as Officer attempted to lead Duke away, the dog planted his feet and refused to move, still pulling in conflicting directions, still whining with what sounded like anguish. It took 3 minutes of struggle before Officer finally managed to get Duke out of the courtroom. An awkward silence followed. The prosecutor looked embarrassed. Officer's credibility had been damaged by his inability to control his supposedly well-trained dog. And Sarah found herself staring at the empty space where Duke had stood, her mind racing. Something about the dog's behavior nagged at her. Something about the way Officer had tried to control the distressed animal. Something about the obvious fear and confusion in Duke's eyes. She didn't understand it yet, but she felt it in her bones. Something was wrong. Something didn't add up. The preliminary hearing continued, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about the dog, about its strange behavior, about the way Officer, face had reddened with embarrassment, and something else, something that looked like guilt. As the judge prepared to rule on whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial, Sarah made a decision. She would find out what Duke had been trying to tell everyone. Because in that moment, sitting in a courtroom where everyone seemed certain of her guilt, that dog's unexplained distress felt like the first honest thing she'd witnessed since her arrest. The courtroom felt different after Duke was removed. The air seemed heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Judge made notes on her legal pad, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor cleared his throat and attempted to move forward with his final arguments as if nothing unusual had happened, But Sarah could see the doubt that had settled over the proceedings like a fine mist. Something had been broken in his narrative by the dog's inexplicable distress. Sarah sat perfectly still, but her mind was a hurricane. She kept replaying the moment Duke had looked at her, really looked at her, before his behavior spiraled. There had been something in that dog's eyes: intelligence, recognition, desperation. It wasn't the eyes of an animal responding to a courtroom environment. It was the eyes of a creature trying to communicate something vital, something it desperately wanted everyone to understand. She thought about the way Officer had jerked the leash, the way his face had flushed with embarrassment that looked almost like shame, the way he'd kept applying more and more pressure to the leash, escalating the dog's distress rather than calming it. Most dog handlers she'd observed, she had friends with dogs, had seen them at parks, knew that pressure and aggression made anxious dogs worse, but had kept doing it, kept trying to force the dog to comply, kept making the situation worse. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this dog's presentation. The prosecutor was wrapping up his arguments. "Your Honor, the evidence is substantial. Multiple documents with the defendant's name, financial transactions linked to trafficking operations, and most importantly, testimony from a cooperating witness, the defendant's own brother, who will establish her knowledge and participation in the trafficking ring. This is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial." Stood for rebuttal, but Sarah barely heard her attorney's words. Her focus remained on the empty space where Duke had stood. The dog had been distressed, yes, but why? What had caused such an extreme reaction? Was it something in the evidence? Something about the courtroom itself? Or, and this thought struck her like lightning, was it something about Officer, about what Officer was doing? Sarah's hands trembled. She clasped them together on the table, trying to maintain composure. But her mind was racing now, making connections, forming theories. What if Duke wasn't distressed by the courtroom? What if the dog was distressed by deception? What if Officer was? No, she couldn't let herself think like this. She was desperate, grasping at straws, trying to find salvation in the behavior of an animal. And yet, the judge was preparing to rule. "Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial. Trial will be scheduled for." Sarah felt something break inside her. This was it. This was the moment where the machinery of injustice locked into place. The judge was about to finalize her destruction. In hours, she'd be back in her cell. In weeks or months, she'd stand trial where a jury would look at the evidence, the documents with her name, her brother's testimony, the prosecution's narrative, and they would convict her. She would lose 20 years of her life. Her children would grow up without their mother. And it was all based on lies. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The documents had her name, yes, but she hadn't signed them. Her brother had. The financial transactions, she didn't even have access to those accounts. She'd never seen them. The whole thing was fabrication, and here in this courtroom, with all these people in positions of authority, they were about to lock her away based on this fabrication. She thought of Emma and she thought of her classroom and her students. She thought of the lesson she'd been planning to teach on civil disobedience the morning she was arrested. She thought of Parks sitting on that bus, refusing to move, speaking truth to injustice even when every authority figure told her she was wrong. Sarah stood up. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "No, this is wrong." Grabbed her arm. "Sarah, sit down, don't say anything." But Sarah couldn't sit down. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, and she was looking directly at the empty space where Duke had stood. She was looking at where the dog had tried to tell everyone something, where the animal had resisted and struggled and whined in distress. "He's lying," Sarah said, her voice cracking, pointing at Officer who stood near the back of the courtroom. "He's lying." The entire room went silent. Judge's eyes widened. The prosecutor looked shocked, pulled harder on Sarah's arm, trying to force her back into her seat. "Bailiff," the judge said sharply, "control the defendant." Your Honor, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite her tears, that dog wasn't acting that way because of the courtroom. That dog was he knew. He knew something was wrong. He knew Officer was. Ms. Martinez, you need to sit down, the judge commanded. But something in that moment had shifted. Sarah had broken. Sarah had spoken truth in desperation. And in the back of the courtroom, an elderly man in a gray tweed jacket was standing up, his eyes sharp with recognition. His name was, and he'd spent 35 years in federal law enforcement before retiring 5 years ago. He'd worked with K-9 units for most of his career. He knew dog behavior intimately. He knew how dogs responded to stress, to deception, to their handlers' emotional states. And watching Officer's face as Sarah accused him, saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw guilt, raw, undisguised, unmasked guilt. Had been a spectator in the courtroom because he was writing a book about criminal justice reform. He'd come to observe a few preliminary hearings for research purposes. He'd witnessed Duke's strange behavior and had found it as unusual as everyone else. But he'd also noticed something else. He'd seen Officer applying pressure to the leash in ways that suggested he was cueing the dog rather than controlling it. He'd seen the handler's hand movements, the subtle jerks that didn't match the dog's level of distress. During the recess that followed Sarah's outburst, requested a meeting with the judge. In the judge's chambers, he explained what he'd observed. He explained that in his professional experience, dogs don't exhibit stress responses like that without cause. He explained that Officer's leash work had been inconsistent with standard K-9 handling practices. He explained that there were documented cases of handlers falsifying dog alerts to strengthen prosecutorial cases. Judge listened carefully, her sharp mind absorbing every word. By the end of the conversation, she had serious doubts about the integrity of Officer's testimony. Back in the courtroom, as Sarah was being led away in handcuffs, she didn't know yet that her desperate cry had been heard. She didn't know that an old man with 35 years of experience had recognized something wrong in Officer's behavior. She didn't know that the judge had already made a mental note to investigate further. She only knew that she'd spoken the truth, and for the first time since her arrest, someone had listened. That evening in her cell, Sarah lay on her plastic mattress and thought about Duke. She thought about how an animal, unable to speak human language, had tried to communicate something vital, and how a woman with nothing left to lose had finally been brave enough to say it out loud. She didn't know yet that this moment, these two desperate words spoken in a courtroom where everything felt impossible, would be the moment that changed everything. Judge was not a woman who acted hastily. She'd been on the federal bench for 18 years, and she'd built her reputation on careful deliberation and unwavering commitment to justice. But the conversation had shaken something loose in her thinking. She'd trusted the prosecution. She'd believed Officer's credentials. She'd accepted the narrative without question. But what if that narrative was built on sand? That evening, alone in her chambers, she requested the full case file. She reviewed every document. She watched the courtroom video of Duke's behavior and Officer's leash work multiple times. With each viewing, observations became impossible to ignore. Officer's hand movements on the leash weren't corrective. They were cueing. The handler was pulling at specific moments, applying pressure in ways that seemed designed to create behavioral responses in the dog rather than control existing behavior. Judge made a call to the Federal Inspector General's office that night. By morning, an investigation had been opened. What followed was a cascade of discoveries that would eventually take down 3 federal agents and expose a systematic pattern of evidence manipulation. The forensic accountants arrived at the federal building with fresh eyes and no preconceived notions of Sarah's guilt. They were given simple instructions: trace every financial transaction connected to Sarah Martinez's name on the property deed and in the trafficking operation documentation. Within 72 hours, they'd found something remarkable. Sarah's name had been inserted into financial records retroactively. The digital evidence showed alterations, copies made from originals, signatures that didn't match previous examples from her known accounts. Most damning of all, they found the original documents, the ones without her name, in a file marked Archived Materials on Agent Richard's work computer. Was the cold-eyed interrogator who'd threatened Sarah, who told her that her brother was cooperating against her, who'd built the initial case against her. He'd fabricated the evidence linking her to the trafficking operation. He'd done it deliberately, knowingly, with full awareness that he was framing an innocent woman. When confronted, initially everything, but the digital forensics team had found email chains, internal communications between Officer James and two other federal agents discussing their strategy. The language was chilling. "Martinez is collateral damage," one email read. "She'll be easy to prosecute given her connection to the brother. Her name on the property gives us leverage with him and with the public narrative. Teacher involved in trafficking. The media will eat it up, and it makes us look thorough." Another email from two, "Make sure Duke alerts on her documents. We need the K9 component to make the case airtight. Juries trust dogs." Response was equally damning. "Duke's conditioned to alert on command. I can make him hit on anything. It'll look natural." When confronted with these emails, Officer broke. He'd been with the federal government for 20 years. He'd been facing pressure from above to close cases, to show results, to boost conviction statistics. When had approached him about falsifying Duke's alerts to strengthen the prosecution's case, had initially resisted, but had promised him commendations, promotions, praise in the media. Over time, had convinced himself that Sarah was probably involved somehow, that framing her a little wasn't really that wrong, that his dog's manipulated alerts were essentially finding truth just in a more efficient way. When the video evidence was presented to him, footage from the courtroom showing his deliberate leash movements, his calculated cueing of the dog's behavior, wept. He confessed everything. He explained how he'd trained Duke using operant conditioning to alert on command, regardless of whether actual evidence was present. He explained how he'd reports in dozens of cases. He explained that had specifically instructed him to ensure Duke alerted near Sarah's supposed evidence to create a veneer of scientific reliability. "I knew it was wrong," said, his voice hollow with the weight of his confession. "I knew it was wrong the entire time." The investigation expanded. Subpoenas were issued. Files were seized. An internal affairs team descended on the federal prosecutor's office like a plague of locusts. What they found was a systematic pattern of prosecutorial misconduct spanning 3 years, cases built on evidence, witnesses coerced into testimony they knew was false, suspects framed to close investigations. The 3 other agents involved, agent and agent, were suspended within a week. Criminal charges were filed against all 3 for evidence tampering, conspiracy, and violating civil rights. Faced charges as well, though his cooperation with the investigation would ultimately result in a reduced sentence. David Martinez, Sarah's brother, faced his own reckoning. His cooperation agreement was voided because the evidence he'd been asked to help prosecute was proven to be fabricated. He was remanded into custody and charged with actual trafficking crimes, crimes that, it turned out, he had been involved with, just not with Sarah. His fake testimony against his sister had been his attempt to reduce his own sentence by giving the investigators what they wanted to hear. The property that had been linked to Sarah's name was actually owned by David and 3 traffickers. Sarah had never had any legal stake in it. Her brother had added her name to documents in an attempt to make his crimes look less serious, to suggest that a respectable person like his sister was involved. Hopping it would make investigators view his participation as somehow less culpable. The entire prosecution case against Sarah dissolved. 2 weeks after his intervention, Sarah sat across from in the Federal Detention Center's visitation room. "All charges are being dropped," said, her eyes bright with tears. "Emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow. You're going to be released." Sarah couldn't process the words at first. They seemed to float past her like something from a dream, unreal and impossible to grasp. "The judge is also ordering a formal apology from the Department of Justice," continued. "You're eligible for a civil settlement. We're talking substantial damages for wrongful prosecution, emotional distress, violation of civil rights." "How much?" Sarah whispered. "Potentially $2 to $3 million. But Sarah, that's not the important part. The important part is that you're free. Your name is being cleared. The world will know what happened here." That night, Sarah lay in her cell, which she knew she'd be leaving the next day, and thought about Duke. She thought about an animal whose instinct toward truth had been corrupted by a handler's deception, but whose authentic distress had broken through that corruption anyway. She thought about Officer's confession, about the moment when he'd finally admitted that he'd been falsifying alerts, manipulating his own dog to serve prosecutorial misconduct. She thought about how one desperate cry, "He's lying," had triggered an investigation that exposed corruption reaching through 3 federal agencies. She thought about 35 years of experience recognizing something wrong in a dog's behavior. She thought about Judge's willingness to question the narrative she'd been given. The system was broken, yes. But in this moment, in this case, it had been fixed. Not because the system was designed to work fairly, but because someone had been brave enough to speak truth into the machinery of injustice, and enough people had been willing to listen. Sarah was finally going home. The emergency hearing took place on a Tuesday morning that felt like it belonged to a different world than the gray, oppressive morning of Sarah's arrest a month earlier. She'd been allowed to shower and wear actual clothes, not the ill-fitting gray pantsuit, but jeans and a blouse that Tom had brought from home. She tried to style her hair, though the effort felt almost laughable after weeks of institutional detention. When she looked in the mirror of the courthouse bathroom, she barely recognized herself, but at least now she looked like a person instead of a ghost. Walked beside her carrying a leather briefcase filled with documents and motions. "The judge has already reviewed the evidence," whispered as they approached the courtroom. "She's ready to drop charges. This should be straightforward." But Sarah paused and took her client's hand. "Be prepared for the emotional weight of this. When the judge declares you exonerated, it's going to hit you." The courtroom was packed. Federal prosecutors sat at their table, but they looked defeated, diminished. The judge had already removed them from the case, assigned a special prosecutor to investigate their conduct. Agent wasn't present. He'd invoked his right to remain silent and was consulting with criminal defense attorneys. Officers and sat separately, also with their own lawyers, their federal careers effectively over. But the most shocking thing was the media presence. News cameras lined the back of the courtroom. Reporters occupied every available seat. Sarah understood immediately. Her case had become a symbol, a watershed moment in discussions about police accountability and prosecutorial misconduct. What had started as a quiet investigation into corruption had exploded into a national conversation. Judge entered, and everyone stood. She settled into her chair and opened her file with the grave demeanor of someone about to render judgment on matters of considerable importance. "This court is in session," she announced. "We are here regarding the case of United States versus Sarah Martinez. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances of this case and the evidence that has come to light regarding the conduct of federal agents and prosecutors involved in the initial investigation." She paused, her sharp eyes surveying the courtroom. "I have reviewed the forensic evidence, the email communications, the confessions of federal officers, and the testimony of independent investigators. I have concluded that the charges against Sarah Martinez were based on fabricated evidence, documentation, and the deliberate manipulation of a police dog by federal agents in an attempt to create the appearance of reliable forensic evidence." Sarah felt tears beginning to stream down her face before the judge had even reached her conclusion. Therefore, this court finds that there is insufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution. All charges against Sarah Martinez are hereby dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled. Additionally, I am officially declaring Sarah Martinez exonerated of all charges. The record will reflect that she was the victim of prosecutorial misconduct and that her arrest and detention were unjustified. Judge looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, on behalf of this court and the Department of Justice, I offer a formal apology for what you have endured. Your civil rights were violated. Your reputation was damaged. Your family was harmed. The judicial system failed you. I am truly sorry. Sarah couldn't speak. She was crying too hard, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to originate from somewhere deep inside her, from the place where she'd been holding herself together through days of despair and nights of terror. Gripped her shoulder, also crying quietly. The judge continued, addressing the courtroom. I am also ordering a full investigation into the conduct of federal agents involved in this case. Criminal charges have been filed against Special Agents Richard and Officer James has agreed to cooperate and will face reduced charges in exchange for his testimony against the other agents involved. This case represents a serious breach of federal authority and public trust. The agents involved will be held accountable. When Sarah finally left the courthouse, she was met by a wall of cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions, pushed forward trying to get closer, desperate for a comment from the woman whose story had captivated the nation. Guided her through the crowd, one hand on Sarah's back, but Sarah found herself stopping. She looked at the cameras, at the reporters, at the watching world. I just want to say, Sarah said, her voice unsteady, that I'm grateful for Judge's commitment to truth. I'm grateful for the retired investigator who recognized something wrong. I'm grateful for officers' willingness to confess and cooperate. And I'm grateful for my attorney, who never stopped believing in me. She paused, her voice catching. But I also want to say that what happened to me should never happen to anyone. The system is broken. Good people can be destroyed by it. And we need reform, real reform, to make sure this doesn't happen again. The media coverage that followed was stunning in its reversal. The same news outlets that had reported her arrest with barely concealed prurient interest now ran investigative pieces about prosecutorial misconduct and K-9 evidence falsification. Teacher cleared in stunning reversal of justice system corruption, read the headlines. Opinion pieces appeared in major newspapers exploring how an innocent woman had been targeted by the very institutions meant to protect her. The Department of Justice issued a statement expressing its regret and announcing a comprehensive review of all cases involving Officer K-9 work and agents' prosecutions. Dozens of potentially wrongful convictions were being re-examined. Multiple defendants were being released. 3 weeks after her exoneration, Sarah received formal notification of her civil settlement. The Department of Justice, attempting to mitigate the damage to its reputation, had agreed to a substantial settlement, $2.8 million in compensation for wrongful prosecution, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. It was an enormous amount of money, more than Sarah could have imagined, yet it felt inadequate compensation for what she'd endured. But it meant something else too. It meant she could take time away from work. It meant she could afford therapy to process what had happened. It meant her family wouldn't face financial ruin. It meant she had choices again. Tom picked her up from the courthouse on the day her charges were officially dismissed. He was waiting by his car, and when Sarah walked toward him, he opened his arms. They held each other for a long moment without speaking. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Tom whispered. "I'm so sorry." "You were scared," Sarah said. "It's okay." At home, Emma and Ann were waiting. Their grandmother had brought them after school. When they saw Sarah, they ran to her, and she held them, breathing in their familiar scent, feeling the small, warm weight of their bodies against hers. They were older than when she'd left. Emma had grown several inches, her voice slightly deeper, had lost a tooth. Time had passed while Sarah was in detention, and her children had continued living, growing, changing without her. "Will you be staying home now?" asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Yes, baby," Sarah said. "Mommy's home now, and I'm not leaving again." That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, something she desperately missed during her detention, and looked at photographs on her phone. Pictures from before her arrest, family vacations, school events, regular moments of ordinary happiness. She'd been exonerated. The corruption had been exposed. The men who destroyed her life were facing criminal charges. The justice system, broken as it was, had ultimately worked in her favor. But Sarah knew that for many others it didn't work this way. For many people wrongly accused, there was no sympathetic judge, no media attention. There was just the machinery of injustice grinding on, year after year, destroying lives without mercy or redemption. She thought about all of them as she finished her tea, and she began to understand what her next chapter would need to be. 2 years after her exoneration, Sarah stood in front of a lecture hall at University Law School, facing 200 law students who were studying criminal justice and prosecutorial ethics. She'd been invited to speak as part of a series on wrongful convictions and systemic reform. These invitations had become a regular part of her life. Universities, conferences, advocacy organizations, and law schools all wanted to hear her story. But standing here, facing these future lawyers and judges, Sarah felt the familiar combination of nervousness and purpose that had become her constant companion since that day in the courtroom when she'd cried out, "He's lying." "I was a teacher," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I taught history to middle school students. I believed in the justice system. I believed that truth ultimately prevailed. I believed that if you were innocent, the system would protect you. And then I learned how wrong I was." She clicked through slides showing her arrest, her detention, the headlines that had labeled her a criminal. She showed the students the emails from the federal agents, the confessions of officer, the courtroom video of Duke's distressed behavior, the moment that had changed everything. "The system didn't fail because individual bad actors corrupted it," Sarah explained. "The system failed because it was designed with built-in incentives for corruption. Prosecutors are rewarded for convictions, not for justice. Police officers receive commendations for closing cases, not for finding truth. We've created a machinery where an innocent person can be destroyed not through malice alone, but through structural incentives that reward conviction over integrity." The law students took notes feverishly. Sarah had become, despite never wanting this role, one of the most compelling voices in the criminal justice reform movement. Her case had been the subject of a podcast series, a documentary, and multiple academic papers. Universities invited her to speak. Civil rights organizations made her a consultant. Her story had become a touchstone in discussions about police accountability and prosecutorial misconduct. But Sarah's advocacy went far beyond speaking engagements. She'd founded the Martinez Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating potentially wrongful convictions and providing legal support to people who'd been wrongly accused. Using settlement money from her civil case, she funded investigations into dozens of cases. Her team included former federal investigators, forensic specialists, and passionate young lawyers who believed in second chances. The work was heartbreaking and rewarding in equal measure. They'd identified 43 cases involving officer-fabricated K-9 alerts, and 17 people had already been exonerated. They'd found evidence of prosecutorial misconduct in 21 other cases. They'd helped overturn convictions, reunite families, and restore the lives of people the system had destroyed. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of Sarah's advocacy was her work with K-9 training programs. It had started as an accident. 6 months after her exoneration, Sarah had received a call from the federal K-9 training facility where Duke was now retired. The director wanted to implement new oversight protocols for K9 handlers, ways to verify the integrity of dog alerts and prevent handler-induced false positives. They wanted Sarah to consult on the project because she understood firsthand how fabricated evidence could destroy lives. Sarah had been hesitant. Duke represented the moment her life exploded, the animal whose distressed behavior had been manipulated to frame her. But she'd gone to the facility anyway, and something unexpected happened. Duke recognized her. The old German shepherd, now in his early 20s and moving slowly with the stiffness of advanced age, had been resting in his enclosure when Sarah approached. His ears perked up. He stood slowly, moved to the fence and pressed his muzzle against the chain link. His tail wagged cautiously, but it wagged. Sarah had cried. She'd cried for the animal that had tried to tell the truth despite his handler's manipulation. She'd cried for all the innocent people whose cases had been destroyed by this dog's corrupted alerts. She'd cried for the bizarre alignment of events that had led to her salvation. She'd knelt down and hugged Duke through the fence. "You tried to tell them," she'd whispered. "You knew something was wrong, and you tried to tell everyone, and nobody listened until I was desperate enough to hear you." Sarah had stayed at the facility for 3 hours that day, sitting with Duke, talking to him, scratching behind his ears. The old dog had leaned against her, and in that moment, Sarah had made a decision. She would dedicate part of her advocacy to improving K9 training protocols. She would help ensure that no other dog would be manipulated the way Duke had been, and no other innocent person would be framed by fabricated canine evidence. Over the next year, Sarah worked with the training facility to develop new standards: mandatory video recording of all K9 alerts, independent verification procedures, psychological testing for handlers to identify those prone to confirmation bias, regular audits of previous cases. The protocols became a model adopted by federal and local law enforcement agencies across the country. Her marriage to Tom didn't survive the aftermath of her ordeal, though they remained friends and excellent co-parents. The trauma of her arrest had created a rift that eventually couldn't be bridged. They divorced amicably 2 years after her exoneration, and while it was painful, it was also necessary. Tom had his own healing to do, and Sarah had to focus on her own transformation. She'd also returned to teaching, though not at middle school. Instead, she taught at an alternative high school for at-risk youth, students who'd been failed by the system, who didn't fit into traditional educational models. She used her story to help them understand that the world wasn't always fair, but that their response to unfairness mattered. That speaking truth, even when it was terrifying, was sometimes the only power you had. Emma, and now 16 and 13 respectively, had grown up with a mother who'd become nationally recognized. It was strange for them sometimes, having their family trauma become public fodder for documentaries and podcast series, but they were also proud of her. Emma had decided to study law, inspired by and by witnessing her mother fight through an unjust system, was still figuring out his path, but he developed a passion for advocacy and social justice. One evening, 3 years after her exoneration, Sarah sat in her backyard under the Portland sky. It was twilight, that soft in-between time when day transitions to night. She thought about the woman she'd been before her arrest. That person felt like someone she'd known in another lifetime. She'd been happy then, but she'd also been naive. She'd believed in systems she should have questioned. She'd assumed that being a good person, following the rules and trusting institutions would protect her. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd learned something more important in her wrongful imprisonment and subsequent exoneration: that justice wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you had to fight for, often at great personal cost. And that sometimes in the darkest moments when you had nothing left to lose, speaking truth, even desperate, terrified truth, could change everything. She thought about Duke, old and retired now, living out his final years at the training facility where Sarah visited him regularly. That dog had been manipulated and corrupted, yet in his distress, he tried to communicate something true. He tried to tell everyone that something was wrong. Sarah understood now that her job was to keep telling that story, to keep insisting that what happened to her mattered, to keep working so that the system could be better. Not perfect, she'd learned to stop expecting perfection, but better, more just, more committed to truth. The Martinez Justice Initiative was now operating in 12 states. The criminal justice reform initiatives Sarah had championed had been adopted by federal agencies. Dozens of wrongly convicted people had been exonerated through her organization's work. Her speaking engagements reached thousands of law students, judges, and prosecutors every year. And it had all started with 2 desperate words spoken in a courtroom by a woman who had nothing left to lose. "He's lying." Sarah closed her eyes and breathed in the cool evening air. She was finally home, not just in her house but in her purpose. She'd survived the machinery of injustice, and now she was working to dismantle it, one case at a time, one policy at a time, one person at a time. The American dream she'd once believed in had been shattered. But in its place, she'd found something more meaningful, the power to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone the system had failed.